The Northern Chapters. Chapter 26. The Promise. By Mark Tunnacliffe. Beginnings. Alright, mate. Same as you sitting in this shit. I remember vividly the afternoon I met this fella. He was huddled behind a tiny umbrella that was getting a terrible beating off an evil easterly wind. It was on a barren, windswept gravel pit during the last few days of the season in March 1990, and we stood together with our backs turned away from the water, trying to find a little respite from the bitter wind that should have carried some snow, but it had probably been nicked as it passed through Salford. We chatted away for an hour or more about anything to do with carp over a lukewarm cup of coffee from Ray's tiny flask. I knew there were only a couple of guys fishing for the carp on the pit, and like me, this was to be Ray's first season. Ray seemed like he was a really friendly guy, a quiet man who spoke with a hushed tone to his voice, who thought deeply about his next words. Me, on the other hand, probably came across as the complete opposite, a bit brash, outgoing and confident, but we struck up an immediate friendship and exchanged addresses and home telephone numbers. No mobiles around at this time. Ray was a fairly local lad, and as I was to find out, the quiet man had a rum side also. He really was a proper Salford lad. Ray's ideas and approach to carp angling were very much the same as my own. Keep it simple. Location, presentation, application. Little was I to know that on that afternoon, after only a brief encounter, a great bond of friendship had been formed. Ray said he was working night shifts in a local factory at the time, and after a couple of hours kip, was able to get on the bank for a few hours, either to fish or to have a mooch. I was pretty fortunate myself in that I was self-employed and subcontracted work from other companies, so I could work weekends and fish during the week and generally finish work at any time I chose to. We agreed we would contact each other when we were going to fish on there, so we could maybe work together to catch a carp or two from the pit. The late afternoon ebbed away into dusk, and I left reluctantly, with a firm handshake and a smile. Yeah, it was alright, this fella. As I reached the van, on the bit of rough ground where the locals parked, I was already running through my mind the observations and ideas Ray had shared with me. He had done a few afternoons and had seen the odd show at the end of February and into March. Generally, he had seen these shows around midday, albeit nothing major, just the odd fish. He hadn't moved on to them, but had just sat tight, maybe thinking they would turn up on his bait. The shows hadn't always been in the same part of the lake either, still in the middle, but sometimes far to the left or right. I sensed that the fish were going to be really mobile, and getting on them, or moving as close as possible to them and judging where might they be heading, could be a tactic to produce a bite. Ray had also commented on the Canadian pondweed. It was still profuse after the winter and seemed to be in bands that ran the full length of the lake, following where the drag on the tractor had left depressions on the lake bed. There were clear areas between the weed that ran perfectly parallel to weed bed straight down the lake. My mind was racing. Do they use the clear areas to travel up and down the lake? Is that why they are so mobile? The current season had only a matter of days left before it closed, although I had no chance of getting on there to fish because the current job was on a retainer and had to be finished. A lot of legwork, observation and feature finding was going to have to be done during the closed season. I hardly thought of anything else that evening. A spark had ignited a fire inside me that day that felt like it was going to be there for the rest of my life. It was sometimes going to rage like a forest fire, and at other times flicker like a candle flame on a shrine held for a lifetime love. The teardrop-shaped hole in the ground where Ray and I had met was a 15-acre water that had been a gravel extraction for local motorway works in the late 1960s. It was dug, then scraped to leave a slow gradient from the bank that met the water level out to the middle of the pit. The lake bed had been left as a basic bowl shape, with shallow troughs running the full length of the lake caused by the bucket of the dragline excavator. The workings had also left a small outcrop of sandstone to create an island down the narrower end of the teardrop shape. After the excavation work finished, it was left to nature, and slowly the sloping banks grassed over, and the odd small copse of willow trees gained a foothold. There was little natural shelter to hide from the elements, especially the big winds that whipped up and down the Irwell Valley. There was a small patch of gravel where you could park around 6 cars, about a quarter of a mile from the lake, and a very narrow muddy footpath that ran on top of the hill, right round the perimeter of the lake. It was a fair old height to carry your gear round to the other side, and a treacherous one after heavy rain. You rarely met anybody down there, just the odd dog walker, or a couple of guys with air guns now and then. I hadn't come across many anglers on there when I had strolled round, just a pike angler or a couple of guys sitting on seat boxes. The pit was still in its juvenile stage of maturity, and nature needed a bit more time to weave its magic. It is situated around 4 miles west of Manchester city centre, right on the edge of suburbia, tucked away down in the Irwell Valley, and the River Irwell snakes its way towards the Manchester Ship Canal, sometimes metres away from the lake's banks, deep down in a sandstone gorge. As a young lad, I grew up playing around the pit, which we knew as the Quarry. Later, as it slowly filled with water, it became known locally as Clifton Marina, because during the summer months it was very popular with swimmers and boating enthusiasts. The water was secured in the mid-1970s by Albert Morris, who was chairman of Salford Inter Angling Club. Albert was a very shrewd fellow. He would exchange his many years of skill and knowledge of netting waters to clubs that needed his help. Instead of any payment in monetary terms, he demanded pounds in weight of fish that were used to stock Clifton. Albert would come to an agreement about which species and how many of that species he wanted after a few sweeps, and then did the deal at the end. The club planted iris and reed mace around the lake's margin, and periodically carried out a few stockings of fish. They first stocked silverfish, then around the late 70s, early 80s, single-figure carp purchased from priory fisheries were introduced. A couple of years later, they stocked a handful of double-figure carp rescued from a mill lodge in Horwich, Cook and Nuttall, that was due to be filled in. Clifton was certainly still very much untapped, and the lure of uncaught and unknown fish certainly appealed to me. I fished in and around the Cheshire area during the middle to late 1980s, learned so much, and enjoyed myself immensely. I mainly fished alongside my dad, who introduced me to angling with a proper apprenticeship from a young age, with a final introduction to carp angling when he thought I was ready. During a conversation at work, I suggested to my dad that we should maybe have a look at fishing Clifton. His reply was short and to the point, as it always was. It needs another 10 years, son, so I was a little apprehensive to tell him that I was planning to fish on there for the coming season. I just cut the conversation short right there, and had already decided that if I had to, I would fish on there alone. I would have preferred it if he had agreed, so he could have given his unlimited wealth of knowledge and advice, but I also knew that usually his word was final. I thought the place had the potential to be something really special, maybe not in terms of sizes of the fish at the time, but more in the way of a whole new adventure right on my doorstep. I couldn't place my finger on one particular reason, but it was though fate had offered me something that was simply too good to turn down, and I wasn't going to deny myself. Footprints. In the gloom of the first few moments of daybreak, the foot-wide path down to the lake didn't look too appealing. A heavy early morning dew had caused the meadow grass to droop top-heavy over the path, and within a few yards, my trousers were absolutely soaked from the knee down. Shit. It was obvious that no one was around because I was the first dickhead to get wet. A thin layer of mist hung over the water, and it was dead still and eerily quiet. I lit a cigarette and stood looking at the steam coming from my soaking legs. For probably the first time since I'd started carp fishing, I found myself questioning what I was doing. I turned around to head back to the van and took a couple of steps. I'm out of my depth. What the fuck am I doing on here? A loud crash in the far margin sent the coots into hysterics, and the male rushed over to the squeaking chicks, reassuring them by furiously stomping the water where the fish had shown. The moment of panic was gone in an instant, and I was marching at speed. By the time I'd made the half-mile walk to the far margin area where the fish had shown, the meadow grass dew had seeped upwards to my town halls, and it looked as though I'd have totally pissed myself. Uncomfortable and cold, I instantly turned into praying mantis mode as I crept down the bank through the loopings and neared the water's edge. Crouched, rigid frame, I moved inch by inch with my head just above the cover, my eyes fixed on the water, not even daring to blink. There was still froth on the scummy surface left from the disturbance, and in slow motion I got to my knees and untied the pair of rods. I was rattling uncontrollably, like an epileptic spider, and struggled to light a cigarette to try and gain a little equilibrium. "Get your shit together, son." I finally managed to bait the hair and fit a stringer to the hook. I immediately returned to stealth mode as I crept further down to the water's edge, but it was a struggle to see through the amount of steam rising through my wet body. There was a narrow footpath about a metre from the water, and as I gradually inched out of the cover of the lupin and grass, I stopped. What the? A few metres up the bank, there was a pair of legs stretched out across the path. Nah, I'm not having it. It was, though. It was definitely a pair of legs. I leaned the rod and rolled up landing net against a sapling, stooped myself over and walked up to the legs as a million different scenarios ran through my mind in a few seconds. What if it's a dead body? What if it's a maniac? The guy must have been half asleep as I trod on a dry twig that snapped with a loud crack. Ah! Ah! We both reacted with a kung fu style defence posture and then fell about laughing hysterically. It was Ray. He turned around bellowing laughter, not being able to look at me without going into another fit of laughing. Where the fuck have you been? In the river? I looked at my sorry state, with twigs, flowers and grass sticking out of me like an old scarecrow, and I was dripping from head to toe, steam rising from me like a volcanic spring. Where are your footprints then? I was the first on. Footprints? What are you on about? In the grass, your footprints. Ray replied with a big grin on his face. I never leave footprints, mate. I came along the canal towpath on my bike. Belonging. We both grafted for the handful of fish we caught. Ray's first was an immaculate common of £18 from just off the island, and amongst the fish I caught was one of the doubles rescued from the Mill Lodge, a true Leanet original linear mirror, also of £18. Simple tactics of wandering around and waiting for signs, then moving to them was working really well, as were small pop-ups straight off the lead at varying lengths by guessing how high the weed was off the lake bed. Some days, as I arrived, Ray would be leaving, so a chat and a point in the right direction was always welcome, and I always repaid the compliment by giving Ray the benefit of my experience on the telephone for the day after. Sometimes, Ray would have his young son, Chris, tagging along with him. He would happily set up a float rod and while away the hours flicking roach out from behind the reed mace, and it wasn't long before he received the nickname Noddy. We were sweeping through quite a few fish by the time autumn came around, and I was benefiting from a number of fish I had caught off the surface during the warmer weather. We were aware, from talking to a couple of lads who mainly fished on the weekends, that the lake was yet to produce a £20 carp. It seemed that the mill doubles were the biggest fish in Clifton, although the common that Ray caught was one of the priory stock fish, along with another couple of doubles, one of which was a linear named Peter Perfect. I came across Peter amongst a 4-fish catch during a 2-hour session from the Wide End Bay in late August, and the immaculate linear weighed in at £16 4 ounces. News of the fish we were catching had filtered out to the local grapevine, and regular visitors were becoming the norm during a couple of hours session after work. We were rolling, and the wait and see, then move on to them with enough bait for a bite tactic just seemed to do it for the short window of time we were fishing. It was mid-September, and the shows had slowed. We were just not seeing them to move to, and we discussed whether or not they had finished and were slowing down. As a pair, we had racked up a number of blanks in September, with nothing to show for our efforts, and it was frustrating. Were they being active, feeding after dark and showing after we'd gone home? The late October afternoon was cold, and it was overcast with not a breath of wind. I hate fishing with no wind. I hadn't arrived until 3 p.m, and it was going to be dark by 5 p.m, but I was there, so I chucked them out and did the observation so that I could file a report for Ray. I opted for the lazy bank closest to the car park and scattered 30 baits around 30 metres and placed 2 bottom hook baits out, then commenced attacking the cigs and flask. Twilight came around just as I finished the last dregs of coffee from the flask. It was time to blow. Dusk had turned the lights out, the chair was folded, the net rolled up, and as I went to pick up the right-hand rod, a fish fell out on its side, leaving a flat spot over the scattering of bait. Immediately, I lit another cig and stood for around an hour, watching a show every 15 minutes in the bright reflection of the moonlight. What the fuck are they doing? It was 6:30 p.m. and I needed food, a drink, and I really needed a fish. The left-hand dock tonic came to life, and I managed to get the fish over the band of weed and into marginal clear water, and quickly returned a low double common. Yes! I was wrapping up the rod, absolutely delighted, when the right-hand rod absolutely melted away. A standoff ensued after the juddering and grating down the rod signalled the carp was in the weed bed beyond the channel, and after 10 minutes or more with no movement to the rod tip, I laid the rod on the rest and waited. The alarm gave a couple of bleeps, and I wound down and pumped furiously, feeling a dull thump, then dead weight. I netted the ball of greenery and quickly threw out the strands of weed like an excited child unwrapping a present. Nothing. I rang Ray as soon as I arrived home and relayed the evening's events. We arranged to do a couple of evenings into dark. Each day, I baited with a few kilos of boilies before I went to work, another kilo mid-afternoon, then simply fished stringers when I arrived an hour before dark. We cleaned up. Ray managed 5 fish, doing 2 3-hour evening sessions. Then unfortunately he contracted a flu-like virus that flattened him. I fished 5 3-hour evening sessions, joined sometimes by a guy called Jay Barrett, which resulted in 18 fish, including the lake's first 20-pound carp, the Mill Lodge Linear. The fish went on feeding sporadically into mid-November during the evening sessions. We ended the year arriving in the dark, then just pacing the bank, waiting and watching for a show, and casting stringers to the show, which often resulted in a bite. The winter day sessions were tough to say the least. It was though someone had opened a cupboard door, and the fish had all gone in and shut themselves away until they decided to come out. We fished most afternoons and into dark, so maybe we were missing the tiny feeding time slot whilst we were at home. There was a lot to think about and work out. The first season was approaching its end, and during a full day session in late February, Ray received a 2-inch drop back on one of his rods that was in the centre channel down the middle of the lake. "Tench," he said. "It's a mirror," I said, as I slid the net under a low double-figure mirror. We named it the rough fish because its whole body felt like an abrasive cloth. Our first christening of a Clifton carp, and we spent the afternoon basking in the little bit of glory that only we would ever remember. We chatted until dark about the first season and agreed that the tactics we chose were absolutely spot on. The short session fishing and being extremely mobile had produced results we never envisaged. We felt we were now part of something really exciting and special that was happening on Clifton. We were unlocking the pit's secrets, but unknowingly opening a door to the outside world that we would later sometimes wish we could have kept bolted for just a little longer. The season's events had cemented the bond with Ray, and the real sense of belonging on Clifton meant there was no other place to be in the world right now. The A-Team. The seasons passed by quickly, and word of the tremendous fish Clifton was producing was now common knowledge on the northwest grapevine. By the mid-1990s, Clifton was producing numerous 20-pound plus fish, and it was at times receiving a fair amount of angling pressure. I had moved on by this point, and was enjoying my time on another gravel pit further north, Wire Lake, on the fabulous Wireside complex. No matter where I was, or what I was doing, I was always eager to keep my finger on the pulse about the goings-on at Clifton. Regular walks round the lake, with a brew always on offer from one of the lads for a catch-up of what had been happening, was now simply a part of my life. The bankside was also flourishing, and as each spring came around, there was a thicker, lush green look to the place. There were now definitive swim names that were to become synonymous with areas of the lake, and anglers would head to a part of the lake by being given a swim name. Worn areas between the tree lines and openings in the reed mace were identified, such as the Swan's Nest, the Overflow, and the 6 o'clock. Clifton was maturing into a beautiful venue with a fast-growing head of carp that was creating a real buzz in the northwest. There was a group of 4 fish that seemed to be doing a little better than the rest, and coincidentally, they were from the single-figure stockfish from Priory Fisheries. The common that Ray had caught as his opening fish in our first season was fast approaching the upper 20-pound mark, and it had been given the simple name of the Big Common. It was a classic-looking fish, scale perfect, and the top of many anglers' lists. I mentioned Peter Perfect a little earlier as a capture I made in my first season as a £16 fish, and now Peter was also climbing to the upper 20 mark, but being a male tended to hold at a fixed weight for a season or two, then bang some on again. Peter was a short frame fish and tended just to bulk outwards and gain on the gut. The third fish was one I was proud to witness when it received its name on capture, because it was my dad who caught it on his first visit to the water. We marvelled at the peculiar back to front and upside down broken linear scales down its lateral, and my dad remarked that they looked like walnuts. So, walnut it was, and as she approached the mid-20 mark, she suddenly blossomed into this creature that was desired by all. The fourth fish was a dark, inconspicuous mirror, which I had caught in March 1991 at £16. It was nothing special, just another double, with little scaling and a pronounced hump. It was part of a group of around 5 fish that were very much alike. Jay Barrett named it Mr. Angry on the overflow one afternoon in 1993 during a 5-fish catch. A couple of lads were present as we weighed her at £18 9 ounces, and someone remarked that she had a stare that could make you die. During the photo shoot, she stiffened out every fin on her body and stood her dorsal fin up like a sail waiting to catch a breeze. That fish just bristled with attitude. It also passed us by in the moment that this fish had gained 5.5 pounds in under 2 years. The 5mm lodge fish that were still around were also thriving, and were all now established, much sought after £20 fish, especially the one-off starburst mirror, Bluey. The original linear looked as though it had been in for a total makeover and was carrying weight as a steady mid-20. Ray had done the off now and then to other local lakes after his usual early season visits on Clifton. He was finding the busier banks and repeat captures a little tedious, which was why he enjoyed the quieter early few months that made him realise how good we really did have it a few years earlier. Ray was still using the short session, enough bait for a bite approach, and would never simply set up for the sake of it. He would often just sit and wait, scanning the water for hours until he saw what he needed to, and sometimes he would only spend an hour actually fishing. He had something that no one else on the water at the time had, which was exceptional watercraft. The fish were maybe becoming a little more educated in terms of rigs and beds of bait, but putting that baited hook in the exact spot at the right time carried on being the recipe for success for Ray. It was a late afternoon in September 1997, and I remember my Sony Ericsson mobile phone ringing. At this time, the expectation of Clifton producing its first £30 carp was at an all-time high. The caller was Tom Massey. "All right, Tom, what's happening?" "I've just had Angry at £30 3 ounces. "Where are you, mate?" "I'm on the first sandbank. I'll be down in a minute, mate." Personally, I thought Peter would have done the magical £30 mark first, but it had slowed down again and this was a steady £29 fish. Tom was absolutely ecstatic. Clifton's first 30 was a bit of a dark horse and a difficult one to catch to add to Tom's achievement. The decade ended, and what a decade it had been. We never thought the fish would reach the weights they did over those first 10 years, but Clifton was only just coming into its prime in regard to the quality of the carp fishing. My dad had been absolutely bang on with his prediction. It really had needed another 10 years. I wouldn't have changed a single moment I spent on there though, not one. The new millennium brought many fresh faces to the banks. Some had been on briefly many years earlier and had moved to pastures new, then returned to seek out the big fish Clifton now held. I returned myself now and then, but only for a very brief look. The banks were a little too busy for me, and long gone were the days of being self-employed and free to fish at will. There was a new generation employing very different tactics to how Ray and I had fished the place. Most were session anglers who were willing to sit and wait, making swim choice for a couple of hours not always a viable proposition. Still, there was always a chance of catching a couple by stalking, and this was how I approached my fishing if I nipped down for a few hours, although it was much easier to stay away and fish elsewhere. Peter Perfect was a steady £30 fish now, and the big common had been caught at 30 but sadly died. I buried the common under an apple tree behind the pipe swim after I'd received a phone call to say that it had been seen drifting about. Ray had moved on to another prestige northwest water, the mighty Reedsmere in Cheshire. He told me that the strict rules were a bind and the locals were stitching the 48-hour rule, but was enjoying the fishing and catching a few. He was still slipping onto Clifton during quiet periods, and as ever, managed to catch a few. He even bagged Mr. Angry a couple of times in the mid-30 bracket. Ray was the only angler ever to catch the first fish of the season 2 years on the run, and both times the fish was Mr. Angry. He simply had the knack. During a brew one afternoon, I spoke to Jay Clark. "If you ever catch Mr. Angry at £40, you must ring me. I will need to be there." "I will, Tudger. You can bank on it, mate." Jay had returned to Clifton after a few years away. I'm sure he wouldn't mind me saying that I classed him as a session angler, but with a twist. He deployed a very heavy pre-baiting campaign for a few weeks, followed by a week of sitting on even more bait. I had visited Jay a few days earlier as he was getting into a week's session in late October on the sandbanks, and back then I left at the new name that Jay had given to the trio of big fish that were now the water's main targets, the A-Team. The fish absolutely rocketed in 2006 in terms of weight due to the number of anglers applying good quality bait. Clifton was on the very brink of becoming the number one water, and everything was falling into place for autumn to be the time. I answered the phone. "Alright, Jay." "Alright, mate. Look, remember you saying you needed to be there if Angry ever did 40? "Yeah." "Well, you have to come now, mate. I've just had her at £41 7 ounce. "No, never." "I have, mate. Get yourself down here now." I had never really prepared myself for this moment, but it was an absolute pleasure to be there for every camera click and every word said. The real bonus for me was the fish's quality condition, as proved by the photos. Falling down. Many anglers returned to Clifton the following year, and Ray was back too, although only between jaunts and reeds, and if anyone was going to catch Mr. Angler during 2007, then there was only one bet that I would wager on. I was lucky enough to secure a ticket for a water in South Manchester the season before, and between fishing Smith's in Bolton, I could only afford the odd hour at Clifton. I was handed a gift in May in the shape of the half limb from the water of my new ticket at £40 14 ounces, so there were now 2 Manchester £40 fish. The local carp angling scene was on fire during 2007, and Clifton produced the highest ever combined weight of its stock. Things were looking really good, and it seemed that Clifton was to become the future Premier Water in the north. "I'm on if you fancy a brew, mate." A smile instantly filled my face. "Yeah, no worries, I'll be down in 5. I hadn't spoken to Ray for a while face to face, because he hadn't been on Clifton too often in the last few months. He hadn't put in a major shift early in the season when I thought he would. He had been on, but only a couple of times, and then disappeared. Maybe he was going to try and wait until the autumn for a go at Mr. Angry and try and talk me into getting on with him, like the old times. On the way down, I had a little question and answer list set out in my head, and looked forward to discussing it. One of my favourite sayings at the time was, "I wouldn't mind £1 for all the hours we spent gassing on here, we'd be rich men." I could see him in the grassy swim, on the edge of the big bay. On the way round, I had already decided how I would tell him to fuck off if he tried to get me to do the autumn for Mr. Angry. Ray knew I had never been a do-or-die angler that purposely set out on a mission to catch one fish from a water, because for me, life is too short. Catch them all as you go on your way, and if everything goes to plan, then the big ones will come along on the journey. I was buzzing to hear how he was going to approach catching the big girl, and see if I could offer any input to help him capture a Manchester 40. "How are you, fella?" A smile and a firm handshake had always been the norm, but this was different. Right from the outset, I could sense that he was really uneasy. "Go on then, what you been up to?" He looked at me in the eye for a brief moment, then just held his head down looking at the floor. I lit a cig and talked on it deeply, waiting. For the first time in my whole life, I didn't know what to do or say. I just sort of mirrored his motions, waiting for him to make a move. He never looked at me. He kind of looked the other way, as though he wanted to tell me, but didn't really want me to know. "Ray, you alright, mate?" He turned and looked at me. "What's up, mate?" In the same old mellow tone of voice, and without any falter, he replied, "I've been diagnosed with cancer." "No! Fucking no way. No, mate." I stood up and gestured with my arms to the water, then turned away. My eyes instantly welled up, and as I swallowed deeply to try to rid the lump in my throat, my eyes released 2 streams that ran down my cheeks and onto my neck. "I'm not having it, mate. I'm not having it. You never drank, never smoked. How have you got cancer? How do they know for sure? Embarrassingly, Ray walked over to me and put his hand on my shoulder to try and console me. They've done all the tests. It's definite. It's from a sunspot, mate, on my back. The wife noticed it while I was in the shower. He sat me down and I lit another cig, trying to hold myself together. Ray was as calm as a summer evening before a storm, with the same feeling of warmth and calmness he always carried about himself. It'll be alright, Tudge. They're going to operate to remove it. They will deal with it. They said it's operable. He assured me that everything was going to be alright and that his family would be right behind him. Man, what are you doing on here with all this going on? I feel okay. The doctor told me just to carry on doing what I do, and this is what I do. I smiled at him in admiration, and a sudden sense of shame came over me. I'd always thought of myself as a bit of a lad, scared of nothing or no one, and I had folded as soon as I thought someone I cared for was going to leave. Then there is this guy standing in front of me, with every reason to be in fear of what his destiny held for him, but he wasn't afraid for what it held for himself, just for those around him who mattered. We chatted until dusk, and we argued, just like the old times, about what items of gear I was carrying back to the car park for him. Ray carried on fishing Clifton, between frequent visits to the hospital, awaiting the results of an operation to remove the cancerous cells. It was a sunny afternoon in July, and I was having my usual stroll around the near bank after work, when I came across a setup I instantly recognised in the social swim. There were my old Harrison Big Pit specials and my old LX reels that I had given to Ray many years before. Yes, it was Ray. How are you, fella? We spent a good couple of hours chatting away about all the shit he'd had to endure, and in between, drifted back to the old days. I just wish I could catch one more fish, mate. That's all I want to do, to catch one more. The desperation in his voice gave me a hint. This wasn't the Froggy that I knew. Ray could walk on Clifton almost any time of any season and catch on spec. He was lucky enough to have been given a gift to be able to do that. As we rambled on about everything and nothing, a common rolled over his right-hand rod. That's a goer, I said. Ray held his hands up in the air, as a gesture, as though he was pleading to someone up above. Shortly after, I netted a £25 common for him and did the honours of weighing her in. We photographed the common, which was one of the priory stockies that had never received a name. Ray was elated. I could see the happiness and joy in his face, but his eyes looked tired and far away. I packed up all of his gear and allowed him to carry his little chair back to the car in case he needed to sit down. As we trudged slowly across the field, he stopped. You okay, mate? I've been trying to say it all afternoon, but I've not known how to. Say what? They've given me 6 months, max. I'm stage 4. This is the last time I'll ever come down here, and the last time that I'll ever do this thing that I love doing. This time I didn't break down. I already knew how I had to behave. It was though he knew I would come down that afternoon, as though he was sitting there waiting for me to turn up, that I would be the person to net his last fish, take the last image of him with one of our beloved carp, and this was how it was going to end. We reached the car park and I put his gear in the car for him and made sure he was okay to get home safely. Hey, Tudge. What's that, Ray? He held his arm out of the car window and gave me a forearm clasp and gripped me as though he was holding on for life. Promise me you'll come back one day and catch her at a weight we never ever dreamed of. I smiled. I don't know, Ray. That's some order. Do it for me, mate. I nodded in agreement, not being able to say the words in case I choked up. Trying hard not to break down, I somehow managed without looking him in the eye. I'm a man of my word, Ray, and my word is my bond, you know that. He smiled, and we parted for the last time ever on Clifton. I went to his home when a friend, Paul Eagle Wollstonecroft, told me, go now if you need to see him. I was made welcome, and we chatted about the serious aspects of his treatment, and then, as usual, we talked carp and his beloved Clifton fish and how they were doing. We parted with a firm handshake at his door, and as I drove away, he waved me off. I wish we had talked more, because I knew we would never see each other again. Ray Froggatt sadly passed away on the 7th of November 2008. There is a light that never goes out. Changes. After Ray's funeral, I seriously and deeply thought about whether to set foot on the banks of Clifton ever again. Nothing would be the same, and it felt like the place had lost its heart and soul. It took a couple of weeks to figure out that I would always have to have ties with the place, no matter what, and the first thing I did was to have a memorial plaque made and inscribed, but I found it difficult to get round to going down and fitting it where it belonged. It was a cold, bright, sunny December afternoon, and I stood alone in the overflow swim, staring at the water. This was where the memorial should be. The big willow that separated the swim from the slabs was a spot where we had sat and chatted for many hours. It was the only really mature tree on there when we first fished Clifton, and it was a popular swim, so many other anglers would be able to recognise the swim as a special place. The memorial plaque would also give me and other friends and family a reason to visit now and then to reflect and remember. Many changes were happening around the new Clifton Country Park, not least the fact that the little piece of Eden was now lost forever and being turned into a free-for-all dog toilet. All the changes were for the worse for the nature in the valley. The influx of hordes of ignorant dog walkers and humanoids with little respect for themselves, never mind their surroundings, was hard to stomach. It boiled my piss so much that it had me forgetting it ever existed. I drifted away, looking for a bit of solace and freedom on the local rivers and quieter lakes, and Clifton suddenly seemed a million miles away. Maybe I was trying to get away from something I should have been fighting for, instead of running away from, or maybe not. A chance crossing of paths one afternoon set me thinking. A young fella, George Phillips, had taken over as bailiff at Clifton, and he approached me with an offer of me becoming a bailiff too. He was a confident guy who had an agenda for Clifton that no one else seemed to have had in the past. Everyone before had simply fished without ever looking into the future. I explained that my dad had always told me never to become involved in club politics. "It'll ruin your fishing," he told me. But it soon became apparent that this fella was thinking a little outside the box, and it got me thinking about how I should really be involved with the future of Clifton. George was a pretty persistent fella, and he knew he wanted someone with a bit of history of the place, and maybe someone who might have a bit of influence from their experiences on the water. I accepted George's offer because it was probably time that I gave something back to a place that had given me so much. Over the years, I have often said that the place would have literally gone to the dogs if George hadn't turned up when he did. He saved Clifton from becoming a non-angler friendly park, period. There was simply no one else around to speak up to aid an ageing Albert Morris with backup at the monthly meetings with the park rangers. George could see a future for the lake, and in 2013 commenced a small but significant restocking of carp to replace the ageing and dwindling numbers. I had discovered another lifelong friendship in George, and his enthusiasm and the dedication of his love for Clifton reunited me with something that had been for a short while dead in the water. The lake was dealt a devastating blow a few years later when a waterborne virus hit the stock. 1 or 2 turned up with large ulcers on their bodies. Some fish were already dead and others were slowly dying. We treated many fish with a remedy I sourced from a fishery owner who had also suffered the Aeromonas waterborne virus, but I got to the stage where I was dreading each day coming around, knowing I was going to be burying another old friend. The lake lost many of its long-term inhabitants and some very big fish. Peter and Walnut, both members of the A-team, fell victim to the virus. It was devastating burying carp that you would watch grow for half your lifetime, reaching the heights of tantalisingly coming so close to being 40 pounds and then perishing so cruelly. Again, George organised another restocking after the kill, and the new fish are thriving amongst the remaining originals and the earlier stockfish. Clifton's future was given a lifeline, and it made me proud to be a part of securing carp angling for others who in the future can enjoy some of the highs and lows that I and many others have experienced. Endgame. I had never really thought about honouring the promise I had made to Ray. Life swept me along to different venues and different aspects of angling, all putting paid to the years that passed in the blink of an eye. I had always stood by my words. If I can see it, I can catch it. I have lost count of how many times over the years that I have pointed people to where I had seen her show, when I was walking the dog, while I was on bailiff rounds, or simply having a chat to an angler. Almost 10 years had gone by without me attempting to catch the fish, and it had become something of an enigma to me. The very last thing I wanted to do was to fish on there again, have to start going through the whole card and suffer the deflation of the fish being caught by someone else after putting in a concerted effort. It had never been my style, and I'm too old to change my ways. Dad, when are you going to catch that big one out of the marina for your friend that died? My daughter Megan cuts a little close to being me. She always speaks directly and to the point. The question hit a nerve, and it swayed me a little. I don't know, chick. It's a difficult one to catch, and I don't have much time. Besides, the lake is always busy. You always say the same. Why don't you just have one last go before something happens to it? You will regret it forever, not even having a go. I know you could catch it if you really wanted to, and you always say you should never break a promise. All right, Megan, enough. I spent the evening pondering her words, and constant flashbacks to the very last conversation at Clifton I ever had with Ray kept me awake for most of the night. If I was ever going to do this, I had to do it on my own terms. I was going to fish exactly as I've done from the very first time I walked on there. There could be no other way. Over the years, I had seen the fish regular during the course of a season, not always in a position of being catchable, but often enough to know where she was in the lake. She rarely ever got caught with other fish around her. She was always a loner, after a couple of her long-time friends that used to tag alongside her died during the fish kill. She was probably harder to catch now than she ever had been, and catching her in a tiny time slot that could only be late afternoon or evening was going to be a task for which I would have to be ready and fully prepared. Spring 2017 had well and truly sprung, and the lake was producing fish to a few of the lads who were doing a bit of time. Remembering where Ray had caught her from, and how many times, always brought me back to the narrow end. The lake acts like a funnel system. It narrows down to around 30 metres wide, and the fish had been getting down there on a decent warm westerly, although I was yet to see her there. I was doing a few laps with a couple of rods tied together most afternoons or evenings, but then I started to leave them at home, at the ready. I could be home and back down to the lake within half an hour if I saw what I needed to, and lugging gear around with no intention to fish was a bit pointless. On an evening stroll round in late May, the wind was blowing a warm easterly up to the big bay end, and it was busy with anglers on the end of the wind because there were a lot of fish showing up there. I walked around the whole of the lake, returning to the narrow end on the back of the wind, and as I stood on a bench for a better view looking down on the water, she suddenly came into view, passing over a large weed bed on her own. She circled the weed bed a few times, then dropped into a hole and disappeared. She looked in good shape, and had obviously held her own over the winter months. The easterly wind was a temporary affair, due to swing full circle to a westerly by the following afternoon, and I had to be waiting. He was already down there, and the wind was forecast to be putting a warm roll on the water, which would cause an undertow in the narrow channel, which I knew would kick-start a feed. It had been a really tough day at work, and I struggled to get myself together to go for the usual stroll round, never mind actually focusing on fishing. Don't forget your rods! I was about to shut the front door and go for a look round without the gear. I looked back up the stairs, and there was Megan looking down to make sure I took the gear along with me. Good luck! I'd actually fished this time, eh? The sky was a pastel grey with not a break, and faint specks of drizzle on the warm, steadily westerly wind spattered my glasses. I stood looking at the weed bed from the vantage point of the bench, lit a cig and saw nothing. When the fish are down the narrow end, by late afternoon you always get a show. By my experiences, if I hadn't seen one between 4 and 5 o'clock, I was looking up the lake to see where they were. I kept swinging my head left to look up the lake, and then realised that what I was looking for wasn't up there, because she was already here. I walked down the path, stopping every 20 metres or so, and stood there scanning. Where was she? I was fast approaching the end of the lake, and I hadn't even seen a tent roll. I leaned on the fence, looking up the lake a little disappointed that they hadn't turned up. Maybe I was out of touch with the habits of the carp nowadays, and my ideas and methods were dated. A few weeks earlier, it had been whispered in my ear by a close friend that he'd overheard someone say I was a has-been. That had coincided with me getting a bit of a whipping off my daughter, and I had moments when I seriously questioned myself. I put my head down on the fence rail and closed my eyes. I had been here many years before. Had I been out of touch for so long from the modern carp scene? Maybe I really was out of my depth. It was almost 6 o'clock. They're not here, mate. The matching pair of blonde female joggers, with smiles as wide as their asses, made the walk worthwhile anyway, and I was considering waiting to see if they were capable of doing another lap when I turned round and looked once again momentarily up the lake. There she blows. I ran the 80 metres up the bank without taking my stare from the show, hoping to pinpoint to the inch where I had to put my rig, and as I walked down the steep, slippery bank, she came out again, exactly where I thought she would have been. The dinner table-sized silk pocket had been a feature of both Ray's and my own captures on the lake for many years. She was still visiting the same area after all this time. I know Ray had caught her here a number of times, hence the area being labelled as Angry's Bush due to a willow tree directly opposite. She showed again, and then deposited a black broken slick on the surface amidst a myriad pinprick bubbles. For probably the first time ever, I was as calm as I could be. First time the needle went through the bait, and the stringer went together in the damp air without a hitch. By now she was steaming the bottom, with a constant cloud of broken weed and twigs popping to the surface among a line of foam bubbles that was drifting on the breeze. As I lifted the rod above my head for a cast to the spot, she rose again up to her gill plates, half out of the water, and then slowly pirouetted and slid away, leaving a maelstrom in her wake. I lowered the rod, rolled a cig and replayed the previous few moments in my mind. It was as though the fish had poked its head out to have a look round. One simple 25-metre flick and the 1-ounce lead and 3-bait stringer hardly made a splash amongst the heavy rolls, and the usual little dunk as the lead and hook bait settled in the scrape gave me a rushing sensation that I hadn't felt for many years. I have often wondered why someone would use excess weight to reach a short distance that is simply going to scare away the fish, especially when you're on limited time. If they know you're there, then their guard is already up and you are on equal terms. I can't wait for them to come back if I scare them away, and I haven't got the time for a paranoid goldfish to regain its confidence. It always has to happen in that moment, in my time, or not at all. In the calm between gusts of the wind, I catapulted 6 baits at a time in a 2-metre box, 25 metres out. The midges were biting hard, and as I searched for my headsock in the rucksack, there was another show, with a repeat plume of detritus rising from the bottom. There it was, a familiar whistle a distance away, and I knew George was on his evening stroll round with Wilson the carp dog. A stocky lifted itself about a rod length out, then another fish. The newbie carp were really enjoying the rollover of the water down here. It became silly, with 2 or 3 shows off the smaller fish under my feet, and every now and then, the big girl gave a show 25 metres away. I assembled a rod for the margin, and disregarded it, and leaned back against the tree. No man, I'm not jeopardising this situation by spooking these fish that could trigger the big girl to leave. George respectfully called his dog back, so as not to disturb me, and happily waved as he yomped past on the far side. I tried to gesture to him that I had seen her show, and then for the first time in my life, I lowered my arm and thought, bollocks, this is all about me this time. The stockfish were having it big time, only a couple of metres in front of me, so I dropped the rod tip within an inch of the bottom, hoping they wouldn't give me any liners. I looked at my phone for the time, and I was getting really agitated. The bait had been in for over an hour, and she hadn't shown for at least 20 minutes. She's done one. I looked at the hanger as the LED on the Neville lit up and the spool melted. This is it then. I never for a second had any doubt it was her. She powered away on a massive 40-metre run up the lake towards the island before she cut a tight arc back on exactly the same line to where she had been hooked. Momentarily, she found weed, but heavy pressure got her moving again straight away. She rolled on the surface down the lake about 40 metres out, then straight line towards me. This was where I was sure I was going to get beaten up close in, because this fish is notorious for its heavy runs up and down the margin, but I kept the rod in a perfect curve, with a line pinging off her body as she suddenly shifted her weight to change direction. My arm muscles were burning, and I was simply hanging on and praying she would tire soon. Suddenly, she stopped dead and held her ground. Shit, she's weeded up. I wound down, pumped the rod furiously, and she suddenly popped up on the surface right in front of me. I waded out almost up to my waist, with the net outstretched. Please, please. And she just rolled straight in. I stood there looking at her in the net. It might only have been seconds, but it felt like a lifetime as a million thoughts raced through my mind. I was interrupted as my brain tried to process what had just happened. "What is it, Tudge?" I turned to see a loaded barrow parked at the top of the hill, and one of the regulars, Kieran Arden, was standing halfway down the hill. "Is it a good un?" "It's angry, mate." "No way, Tudge. I'll ring George to bring the big mat and scales." We prepared the mat and got everything ready on the flat ground on top of the hill, while the fish was safely retained in the margin. Congratulatory handshakes were exchanged, and whilst George and Kieran excitedly whooped it up between phone calls, I just had to walk away from the scene down the path, and I just stood there alone, looking up at the sky. I couldn't see through the tears in my eyes, but somehow I pulled enough of myself together to utter a few words. "That's it, Ray. It's endgame, mate. I wish you were here to see her. She's absolutely magnificent." I turned around and the guys were just standing there looking at me. "You okay, Tudge?" "Yeah, I'm alright." As I walked back towards them, I kept repeating under my breath, "It's over. That's it. It's over." The whole time I was just looking on as a spectator, as you would when someone else catches a fish. I just stood in awe as they put her in the weigh sling and confirmed the weight at 44 pounds 8 ounces. "Come on then, mate. Let's get some pics of you with her." I stroked my hand down her side and looked at her in the eye and said, "It's been a long time." I wasn't going to be jumping in the lake or leaping around. I knew the lads respected that I had to have that bit of space and understood that this was a really personal moment. It had to be a muted affair, to be honest. All I wanted to do was go home and try and understand fully what I had achieved. I guess the enormity of the whole event was too much to take in at the time. After all those years, I hadn't made any preparation for the emotional impact it would have if I were to honour the promise I made to Ray.
Fucking hell, man.
Go on. What an absolute chunk that is.
Fucking yeah, baby. Yeah.
Looking really good again.
Fucking mint. Go on.
That minter. Look at how big it is in the water. Fucking size of that!
Go on, kid. Go on, from one legend to another. Been a long time. And that is my retirement.